Hey everyone, my name is Deryck and this is Franko, and today's verse that we are looking at comes from Exodus 1:8, and it goes like this. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. So this verse it's just feels like it's out of nowhere, but it's really been speaking to me lately because this verse is the only verse that references the Pharaoh from Joseph's time that we see at the end of Genesis, and the Pharaoh from Moses' time that we see at the beginning of Exodus. And the reason I chose this verse today is because it talks about the differences between these two pharaohs, and it highlights it that the Pharaoh from Joseph's time was more open-handed when it came to Joseph. When Joseph came and he had this gift and he used it to help Pharaoh, Pharaoh immediately was open-handed with him and gave him responsibility and gave him power over Egypt and helped them throughout the famine. It helped Egypt immensely because he was open-handed. But then this verse introduces a new Pharaoh that is not open-handed at all. Super close-handed. As soon as he hears of a potential threat that he thinks is a threat, that the Jewish population is getting so big and scared that they're going to overtake all of Egypt because of their numbers, he was scared and was closed-handed and immediately wanted to just annihilate the population or at least cripple them. As I'm reading this, I just start to think of how we can be open or close-handed, and depending on what we choose, it affects our future and affects the people around us, the people that we lead. But what are your thoughts, Franko?
Off the top of my head, first of all, I love the scripture that you chose, and I think it's just like one sentence that describes so much, and there's so much in it. There's so much context to be unpacked. There's so much that it represents. And for me, naturally, when I read these words, I thought of the musical Hamilton. Obviously.
Okay.
It makes sense.
You're going to hate me, but I've never seen it.
I'm not the only one that's going to hate you. Our viewers are going to hate you as well because you haven't seen it. But it just follows the story of Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers. And one of the features of Alexander Hamilton's influence was his relationship with George Washington. A lot of Hamilton's ideals, a lot of what he tries to accomplish, he finds favor with George Washington, and he has a lot of help via George Washington. And Thomas Jefferson, some other members of Congress, are kind of getting annoyed that he has such a favorable relationship. There's a song in particular called Washington on Your Side, and the basic idea of the song is it must be nice to have Washington on your side. And I think that it's kind of similar to the experience that Joseph has with the former Pharaoh and the latter Pharaoh, where the story of Joseph is something that's, typically taught in kids' church, and you see it on a felt board, and we know all about his dream interpretation. We know about the favor that he found in the prison, at Potiphar's house, and then in Pharaoh's kingdom, but we don't really talk about what happens afterwards. And I think it's interesting that when things are going well in our lives, we are quick to identify the fact that God is influencing things and intervening on our behalf. But when things aren't going well, we kind of find it difficult to say, oh, God is clearly working in those difficult moments. And it's like, yeah, God was at work with the former Pharaoh, but God isn't at work with the current Pharaoh. Like it's kind of an error in our thinking, but it's even reflected in Hamilton. Once George Washington decides to end his presidential term at his second term, things go completely upside down for Alexander Hamilton and his influence. So that's what comes to mind. What comes to mind for you?
For me, you saying all that stuff makes me excited. I want to wait until I go into New York. I don't know if it's playing still. I think, is it?
Oh,
is
totally.
It,
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know how all that stuff works. You're the Broadway guy, musical guy, so.
Or you're the football guy.
I'm going to watch it. Let me just say that. And now that you mentioned football, dude, the football season is coming up. And I know I used a football example before. I got to use it again.
Let's hear it.
I miss football so much. The example I wanted to use talking about open-handedness and close-handedness was quarterbacks and just players in general in the NFL. Specifically looking at Aaron Rodgers and Brett Favre. Have you heard? I know I made a video on Aaron Rodgers, so you probably know about him, but do you know about Brett Favre?
Totally.
Yeah, so Brett Favre, iconic quarterback for Green Bay Packers. And then Aaron Rodgers was drafted into the same team, and it was kind of awkward for them, because Aaron Rodgers was drafted as the guy to take over for Brett Favre, and Brett Favre had an opportunity to be open-handed or closed-handed. In an interview, he's like, well, why isn't my job to mentor him? From what I learned, that their relationship was strained. Like, I would have loved to hear that Brett Favre took him under his wing and mentored him, and that's why Aaron Rodgers is so great. Though there was some mentoring involved, Brett Favre didn't seem very open-handed with the power that he had. That's why I bring up not just that situation, but situation for all sports. I think constantly people are like, okay, how can I be the best? And there's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of times that's neglecting the future of the organization. And I think as soon as I said that, I hear like, well, who cares about the organization? But I think as a leader, you want to leave a legacy behind and also just care about the organization. And you don't just care about it because you're on it,
right?
But you care about the fan base, that you want to leave them well. Just like Joseph had 7 years to prep for the famine, 7 years of abundance. He could have just enjoyed that 7 years, but instead he wanted people to prosper afterwards. And so that's just what comes to mind. Again, there's nothing wrong with just focusing on yourself, being the best that you can be just for you. And once you leave, that's it. You do it somewhere else. Yeah, I just think that we're called to live differently.
I think that reveals something that I hadn't previously considered. Because I'm thinking about the person that's reading scripture in Joseph's shoes, and you're talking about the person from the perspective of Pharaoh. And I think that's really, really cool. I like that. I also think that seasons are really important, and this is kind of a reflection of the seasons of scripture. I mean, as you look throughout the entire Bible, there are kings that were in favor of Israel, and then kings that didn't do right in God's sight, especially in the Old Testament. And there's a really important aspect of it where we have to acknowledge like the season that we're in. What comes to mind personally when I'm looking at this scripture, I think about, I don't know much about like the jobs that you've worked outside of ministry, Deryck. What else have you worked in? Did you ever do like retail or food service?
I did sports chalet for a bit, and it was the worst. I did for like 3 months. And I was like, get me out of here.
So I know that you can identify with the experience of like, I clock in and I see the work schedule. I see who's working today, and it's a supervisor that I rock with. But there are some other days where you go in and it's like the person that runs it, like the armed forces, like they take it so seriously.
That's how it was at sports chalet. This lady like was the manager. She would literally like, as soon as she got a call, she would book it across the store. I'm like, dude, it is not that serious.
Yeah.
There's nothing that you should be running so fast for.
I mean, there's a pace. There's a pace to work. There's a pace to the practical. There's like rhythms and seasons. And in this scripture in Exodus, we see kind of the evidence that Israel is heading into a new season, and not reducing God's intervention and God's potential to intervene and work and be present and be heard in our lives because the season doesn't feel like it's a season that calls for it. Like when we clock in and we're working for the bad manager, God can still do amazing things in that season. It's not just 100%. A season of plenty that he can do stuff in. It's not just like when we're talking to the manager and showing them TikToks that we like. God is ever present. He can intervene even though we're not in the most favorable position. What of your life kind of speaks to this scripture?
When Pharaoh of Joseph's time gave the opportunity to Joseph to be able to make a difference, he gave him a chance. Pharaoh of Moses' time didn't at all. And I guess what just comes to mind is bosses. I'm a product of a boss, of a leader that chose to build me out and wasn't threatened by the idea of, oh, this guy could take my place. That motivated him because he wasn't insecure, because he wasn't threatened, because he was open, because he was more of like the Pharaoh of Joseph's time. I think if he was more of like the Pharaoh of Moses' time, I definitely would not be here. And it took somebody just living openly to be able to do that. And I know you're a product of that too.
Totally. That line of thinking that you're going down where it's like, we look at the leader, we look at the boss, and now at some point that responsibility is transferred onto the individual, onto you, onto me, onto the listener, where we have to make a decision as to whether or not we're going to be the former Pharaoh or the latter Pharaoh.
Going back to the example that I used, the sacrifice of Aaron Rodgers or Brett Favre to sacrifice his time and build somebody up that's gonna replace him.
Right.
And what's really cool is that Rodgers is actually doing that right now with Zach Wilson. And he also took a pay cut so that his team can benefit him. And that's the kind of person I want to be and the leader I want to be. And so just for application's sake, what's like the one thing that we should take out of this?
I think there's a lot of value in working this season, talking from the perspective of a Joseph or a Moses, being really keen on the season that you're in and asking God, like, what is it that I ought to accomplish in this season? What is my primary objective? So just acknowledging the season, acknowledging whether or not you're under a close-handed or open-handed Pharaoh, and asking God, like, what is the thing that you want me to accomplish right now? Thank you guys so much for checking out this video. You can click on the side here to check out one of our other videos. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell notification so you can be notified of our future uploads. Have a great rest of your day.